All right, I want to reiterate a few of the definitions that we went over last time, but I just want to make sure that you remember these. So the quadratic function, in its most basic form, the parent function, is f of x is equal to x squared. We call that shape a parabola. So it's a U-shaped graph of the quadratic function. Our vertex is either the lowest or highest point on the parabola, and we'll talk about both of those today. And then finally, our axis of symmetry, which is always an x value and goes through the vertex. All right, let's talk about minimum and maximum values. So a minimum value of a parabola always occurs at the vertex, and it's going to occur if we have a right side up U shape. So our vertex is there and our minimum point is the y value of the vertex. If we have a maximum value instead, that means that our parabola has turned upside down. It's been reflected over the x-axis, and so our vertex creates a maximum point, and it's the y value is the maximum point of our vertex. Notice that as we read our graph from left to right, our values of y are decreasing over here on this minimum value graph until we get to the axis of symmetry, and then they start increasing. The opposite is true when we have a maximum value. Our y values are increasing up to the maximum value that occurs at the axis of symmetry, and then they start decreasing from there. Let's go ahead and look at a couple of examples where we have a graph and we want to pick out all of the characteristics that we can from this graph. The very first thing that we're going to pick out on example 1 is the vertex, and the vertex is at 1, -4, x, y. The vertex in this case is a minimum value because it's the low point, and it occurs at y equals -4. So this is our minimum value line. Our axis of symmetry is perpendicular to that, and the axis of symmetry also goes through the x or through the vertex, but it's the x value of the vertex. So our axis of symmetry is at x equals 1. Now let's talk about domain and range of our graph. Remember that domain is x values and range is y values. So our domain, if you recall from last time, is always going to be all real numbers, or we could write it as -infinity to +infinity if we wanted to write in interval notation. Our range, on the other hand, has a value that it starts at this time, which is at -4, and then it increases from there and never stops. So we could say that y is greater than or equal to -4, or in interval notation, we could say that it goes from a value of -4 up to infinity. Finally, let's talk about that increasing and decreasing interval. So remember that we are decreasing in y values until we get to the axis of symmetry, and then we start increasing or getting higher y values. So we are always talking about the x location. Where in the domain are we increasing and where are we decreasing? So we are increasing starting at 1, not including 1, we're not doing either at 1, and going to infinity. Or we could also write this as to the right of x equals 1, that axis of symmetry. Our graph is decreasing on the left side, so starting at -infinity and going up to but not including 1, we are decreasing. We could also say that that is to the left of our axis of symmetry at x equals 1. I'd like for you to pause the video here and see if you can identify all of the things like we did in problem 1 on example 2 now, and then come back. Now let's see how you did. Hopefully you identified the vertex as being at the point -1, -3. Because it's the highest value on the graph, it is a maximum, and it occurs at the line y equals -3. Our axis of symmetry is the line that vertically goes through the vertex, and it has an x value equal to -1. Our domain this time, just as it always is all real numbers or negative infinity to positive infinity. Remember that that's x values. And as you read the graph from left to right, you run into arrows on both ends of the graph. Our range goes up to a value of -3, but it starts at negative infinity. So negative infinity to -3, including the point -3 with a bracket, or you could say that y is less than or equal to -3. Increasing and decreasing interval. Remember that this is an x value. We are reading the graph from left to right and saying what x values is the y value increasing over and what x values is the y value decreasing over. So our increasing interval is from negative infinity to -1, or we could say to the left of the axis of symmetry, which is at x equals -1. Our decreasing interval, or where our y values are getting smaller, is when x is between -1 and infinity, or we could say to the right of x equals -1.